Okay, welcome back. We are going to continue our skill lesson series with point of view. Now, this is something that you should have talked about in elementary school in your English classes. This should not be new to you, but we are going to do a little bit of a review. So, again, please make sure that you have your guided notes out. You are ready to type. Maybe you have a split screen, maybe you have another strategy. Be ready to pause if you need to, take detailed notes, and make sure that you're going to be good to go on our mastery check. All right, so let's start with some of our point of view basics. When we read, write, or tell a story, it's almost always going to have a very specific point of view. And sometimes authors will use point of view to be a little bit confusing, but most of the time it's going to be pretty straightforward. The narrator of a story is the person or who is telling us that story. Now, it might be a person, it might be an animal, it could be another entity. It's going to depend on the point of view, and it's going to depend on the story, the genre, what they're trying to get across, all of those things. But the narrator is who is telling the story. There's also 3 types of points of view that are going to be the most common when we talk about stories, right? So the first is called first person. This is when the narrator is a character in the story. Often they're going to use words like I or me to tell the story. It's like if you were writing in your diary. Or, for example, our magazine article project was pretty much all written from first person point of view, where you're saying, I woke up and had to go to online school because COVID hit, or I got a new dog and it changed my life, right? So you're telling your story from your point of view. And first person is always going to have the narrator as a part of the story. The second is called second person, and this one is going to be a lot less common because it can be a little bit confusing and a little awkward. This is always sort of a style choice if somebody uses second person, but most often you're going to come in contact with our other 2 points of view. Second person is when the narrator talks directly to the reader using you, right? It's like the story is talking right at you. Hey, you woke up and COVID-19 happened. So the narrator is sort of talking at you as an audience member. Again, this one isn't going to be super important, but I wanted to mention it because it does happen sometimes. Finally is third person. And this one can get a little complicated. There's a couple different kinds, but for today, we're just going to give you more of the overall general description of what it is. Now, this is when the narrator is outside the story. They use pronouns like he, she, or they. The narrator knows what the characters are doing, but they're not a character themselves. So if you're writing a story and you say Sally and Ben woke up, went to school, Sally had to go during lunch to the nurse because she hurt her knee, right? You're not telling the story as Sally. You're telling it as sort of an outside narrator who's watching the story happen and describing it. Now we're going to get into a little bit more detail on our most common points of view. So let's start with first person narration. In first person narration, the story is told from the perspective of a character who refers to themselves as I. The narrator is directly involved in the events and experiences of the story. Again, so it's somebody in the story who is telling it from their perspective. Often the pronouns used in first person narrative are I, me, my, and we. For example, we went to the beach. You're including sort of yourself as the narrator into that. So you are still a part of that we. Okay, this is where we're going to get a little bit deeper into the 6th grade aspect of this, what we want you to learn in 6th grade. It's not just knowing what perspective it is, but how that perspective impacts or changes the story. So first person narration allows readers to get inside the mind of the narrator, experiencing events and emotions directly from their point of view. Again, they are in the story. They are a character in the story, and the story is being told from their point of view. It creates a personal and intimate connection between the reader and the character. You feel their emotions, right? We felt how Rachel was so disgusted and frustrated and sad and upset and mad, and how she was just doing too much about that red sweater. For example, I walked through dark forest, my heart pounding with fear. The trees seemed to close in around me, and I could hear the eerie sounds of the night. You can sort of imagine that you are in the place of the narrator and you're walking through this dark forest and you start to feel your heart pound. and you start to feel their perspective, right? You can see exactly how they might have felt. In contrast, third person narration is the story told by an external narrator, someone outside of the story. They are not a character, they're not involved. It's as if they are watching a movie of what happens. And also, you can have a third person narrator who can't understand and see inside the thoughts of the characters, right? They don't know exactly how they're feeling inside unless they say it on the outside. Or you can have a third person narrator who is all knowing, who sort of knows that Sally feels sad even if she doesn't say it, and he uses that to sort of push the story along. It's just going to depend on the story. But often they use pronouns like he, she, it, or they to refer to the characters, okay? Because again, they are outside of the story. So he walked to school, not I walked to school. So third person narration is going to provide a more objective and distant perspective, right? You're not going to feel those feelings necessarily that your character's feeling because you're not from their point of view. You're not from their perspective. It allows readers to see the story from an outsider's viewpoint, gaining insight into multiple characters' thoughts and emotions. So you get to see more of the big picture. With Rachel in 11, it was like we felt the upset and anger, but then when you stop and you take a step back, you start to realize that maybe she is just overreacting just a little bit. And if she had just sort of said, "That's not my sweater," then the situation might have been different. But from her perspective, it seemed like this horrible, no good, bad day. When in reality, if it had been told from a third person narrator, it might not have come across that way. So, for example, Sarah walked through the dark forest, her heart pounding with fear. The trees seemed to close in around her, and she could hear the eerie sounds of the night. You're being told this story as an outsider. You can sort of watch a movie in your mind of what's happening rather than feeling it like it was you, which is sometimes what happens with first person. So, both first and third person are going to have some similarities and going to have some differences. First, we're going to talk about some similarities. Both first person and third person narrations tell a story, right? They could tell the same story. You could have half the story be in first person and then switch to third person if that's the style choice that you're making in your story. But they do some from different perspectives, right? We just talked about this. How third person is sort of the big picture, while first person is going to give you a more in-depth, detailed view of the character who is the narrator. So in both perspectives, the narrator may share the character's thoughts and feelings, but the way they do it differs. When it's third person, it feels more like an outside look into someone's mind rather than it being you who is feeling that way. And finally, both first person and third person narrations can be used effectively to create engaging and captivating storytelling. One is not better than the other. Now, we could argue back and forth about which stories would be better with each perspective, but at the end of the day, it depends on what the author wants to get across and how they want to tell the story. Now that we've talked about some similarities, let's talk about some differences. First person narration provides a more personal and direct connection to the narrator's thoughts and experiences, while third person narration offers a broader view of the story from an external standpoint. That means that basically first person is going to give you that one character's perspective, how they think, how they feel, what they're doing, how they handle a situation. And third person narration is going to give you the big picture. You're going to see all the characters. Maybe you're going to see their thoughts and feelings, or maybe not. You're just going to sort of watch it as if you were watching a movie. In first person narration, the narrator's knowledge is limited to their own experiences, while third person narrators can access the thoughts and feelings of multiple characters. Now, if you're telling a first person story and something happens, let's say you're telling a story about a friend group, right? And you're telling it from the perspective of one of the friends. That friend wouldn't know about any other conversations that their friends are having without them because it's from their perspective. Now, if you use third person, then you could have the thoughts and feelings of the one friend and also cut into sort of the conversation that the other friends are having. And then you, as the audience, would have both sides of information rather than having to wait for that first friend to find out about the conversation in some way. Finally, first person narration uses I and me pronouns, while third person narration uses he, she, it, or the characters' names. This isn't always going to be true. For example, sometimes you have a non binary character who uses they as a singular pronoun. So you have to know tips and tricks to try and figure this out without fully relying on just pronouns. The other thing is that when people are talking to each other, which is called dialogue in stories, they may use I even if it's from a third person perspective overall. So if you see those quotes and you have some dialogue where you know the characters are talking, don't be fooled because that might not be the perspective from which the story is being told. All right, so now we are going to explore different narrative perspectives. There's going to be two stories with two different points of view, and then you are going to compare and contrast them. Okay, our first person narration is going to be this story. I will read it to you. My adventure at the zoo. I was so excited when my parents told me we were going to the zoo. As we walked through the gates, I could hardly contain my joy. The first thing we saw was the tall giraffes munching on leaves from the trees. Their long necks fascinated me. Next, we visited the monkeys. One cheeky monkey even waved at me. I giggled, feeling like we were becoming friends. We moved on to the lion enclosure, and my heart raced as I saw the majestic lions up close. They roared, and I could feel the ground trembling beneath me. It was an unforgettable day, and I can't wait to visit again soon. And here is our third person narration. It's the same story told in a different way. A day at the zoo. Sarah was filled with excitement as her parents announced their trip to the zoo. They walked through the gates, and Sarah's eyes widened at the sight of the tall giraffes gracefully eating leaves from the trees. They continued their journey to the monkey exhibit. One of the monkeys playfully waved at Sarah, making her giggle with delight. Next, they reached the lion enclosure. Sarah's heart pounded as she saw the majestic lions roaring, their presence awe-inspiring. It was an unforgettable day for the whole family, and they left the zoo with wonderful memories to last them forever. Now that you've heard the two different perspectives on the same story, you're going to do three things. You're going to explore the similarities and the differences between the two narratives. What was the same? What was different? Think about it. Determine if one perspective was more informative than the other. Do you think one gave you more information? Which one did you like more? Why? And finally, you're going to use the Venn diagram, okay, to record your similarities and your differences. The similarities go in the middle, the differences go on the outside. Make sure you label one first person and one third person so we know which one you are talking about. Make sure that you think about how the way the story was told impacted how you felt or how your interest level or what you thought about the story. All right, you guys, you have reached the end. Once you have done this exercise, you have reached the end of our lesson. And if you have taken your notes and you feel like you're ready, you may go back to Canvas and click on the link to take your mastery check. Good luck.